The wind howled like a mournful spirit outside the small cabin, its icy tendrils clawing at the frosted windows. Inside, Andrew Cole sat in silence, the soft crackle of the wood stove his only companion. The cabin's modest interior was a testament to his reclusive life: sparse furniture, walls adorned with photographs of the wilderness, and shelves stacked with books about survival and photography. It had been nearly 3 years since Andrew had left the chaos of the city behind, seeking solace in the isolated, snow-covered woods. But solace had its price. The silence that had once been his sanctuary now felt suffocating, pressing down on him like the heavy snow outside. The grief he had come here to escape hadn't loosened its grip. It clung to him, sharp and unyielding, a constant reminder of all he had lost. A sharp crack shattered the stillness, making Andrew sit bolt upright. He listened, heart pounding, as the sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't the familiar creak of branches weighed down by snow. It was something else. Something alive. He rose slowly, his breath fogging in the cold air as he moved toward the door. His boots thudded softly on the wooden floor, and his fingers hesitated on the latch. He wasn't expecting anyone. No one came out this far in the dead of winter. Andrew cracked the door open, a gust of freezing wind rushing past him, biting at his exposed skin. And there it was. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, a massive shadow hunched in the snow just beyond the porch, its form barely distinguishable against the swirling storm. But then the figure moved, a slow, deliberate shift, and his heart stopped. A bear. Not just any bear, but a grizzly. Its powerful body was weighed down by exhaustion, frost clinging to its matted fur, its breath emerging in labored clouds. For a moment, Andrew stood frozen, fear warring with fascination. Grizzlies didn't come this close to humans, especially not in the heart of winter when they should be hibernating. But this bear wasn't hibernating. This bear was dying. Andrew's instincts screamed at him to shut the door, to lock it and stay inside. But he couldn't. The bear let out a low, guttural sound, a mix between a groan and a whimper, that stopped him in his tracks. Its amber eyes, glinting with desperation, met his. There was something there, something that didn't belong in a wild animal's gaze. A plea. Andrew swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his ears. "What are you doing here?" he whispered, as if the bear could answer. The bear took a shaky step forward, its massive paw sinking into the snow. Andrew saw it then, a deep gash cutting across its foreleg, the edges blackened with frostbite. The sight made his stomach churn. This wasn't just a wild animal. It was a creature in pain, fighting for its life. He didn't know what possessed him to do it. Maybe it was the loneliness, the years of guilt and regret that had hollowed him out, leaving him desperate for some kind of connection. Or maybe it was the way the bear looked at him, like it was begging for help. "Okay," he said, his voice trembling. "Okay, just don't kill me." Andrew grabbed a thick blanket from the couch and stepped onto the porch, the snow crunching under his boots. The bear didn't move, its sides heaving with every breath. Up close, its condition was even worse than he'd realized. Its ribs jutted out beneath its fur, its eyes sunken with fatigue. "Easy," Andrew murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. He draped the blanket over the bear's shoulders, the coarse fabric catching on its icy fur. It flinched but didn't pull away, its gaze never leaving his. The wind howled louder, and Andrew knew he couldn't leave the animal out here. "You're not going to make it out here," he muttered, more to himself than the bear. With every ounce of courage he could muster, he gestured toward the open door. "Come on." You'll freeze to death if you stay out here." To his astonishment, the bear seemed to understand. It took a halting step forward, then another, until its massive frame passed through the doorway and into the cabin. Andrew's heart raced as he shut the door behind it. The cold was kept at bay by the comforting warmth of the wood stove. The bear collapsed onto the floor with a heavy thud, its breathing labored but steady. Andrew stood frozen, staring at the creature that now shared his home. The surrealness of the moment hit him like a tidal wave, a grizzly bear lying on his cabin floor, wrapped in one of his blankets. "God help me," he whispered, running a hand through his hair. He retrieved the first aid kit from the kitchen and approached the bear cautiously. Its amber eyes followed his every move, but it made no effort to rise. "I'm going to help you," Andrew said, his voice shaking. "Just don't eat me." The bear let out a low rumble, almost like a sigh, and lowered its head. Andrew knelt beside it, his hands trembling as he examined the wound. The gash was deep, the edges raw and angry. He cleaned it as best he could, wincing at the bear's occasional growls of discomfort. When he was finished, he wrapped the injured paw in gauze, securing it with medical tape. "There," he said, sitting back on his heels. "It's not perfect, but it'll hold." The bear's eyes met his, and for a moment, Andrew could have sworn he saw gratitude in their depths. It was ridiculous, he knew, but the thought warmed him in a way he hadn't felt in years. As he cleaned up the supplies, he glanced at the bear one last time. "You picked the wrong guy to ask for help," he muttered, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "But I guess we're both just trying to survive, huh?" The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, a fragile peace settled over them. Andrew sat in his chair by the fire, watching as the bear drifted into an uneasy sleep. He didn't know what the morning would bring, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something other than emptiness. Hope, maybe. Or purpose. If you've ever wondered how one night with a wild animal could change everything, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next? Well, let's just say it'll leave you speechless. By morning, the storm had finally begun to ease, its howling winds replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Andrew woke to a dim glow filtering through the frost-rimmed windows, a sign that the sun was doing its best to break through the cloud cover. For a moment, he remained still in the worn leather chair, trying to reconcile the memory of the previous night with the reality of the cabin around him. But the low, rhythmic breathing nearby confirmed it hadn't been a dream. The bear was still here. Andrew turned his head cautiously, his eyes landing on the massive animal sprawled on the floor near the wood stove. Its fur, now mostly dry, had regained some of its color and texture. The blanket he had draped over its shoulders had slipped to the floor during the night, but the creature hadn't moved much otherwise. The bandaged paw lay awkwardly stretched in front of it, its edges frayed from the restless shifting of the bear's weight. He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool morning air. The stove had burned low overnight, leaving the cabin's warmth only a fraction above the biting cold outside. Rising quietly, he added a few logs to the fire, coaxing the flames back to life. The light danced across the walls, catching on the edges of the photographs that hung there, frozen moments of untamed wilderness captured in the solitude of his exile. Andrew glanced back at the bear. Its chest rose and fell steadily, its breath forming faint clouds in the cool air. For the first time, he allowed himself to study it closely. Even in its weakened state, it was a magnificent creature. And yet, for all its power, it had come to him, desperate and vulnerable. The thought stirred something deep within him, an ache he couldn't quite name. Shaking off the thought, Andrew moved to the small kitchen area. His cabinets were sparsely stocked. Canned goods. A half-empty jar of honey. A bag of oats. He frowned. He hadn't considered what a bear might eat. The honey seemed an obvious choice, but it wouldn't provide much nourishment. After a moment's hesitation, he grabbed a can of salmon, the label faded but still legible, and opened it with a manual can opener. "Let's see if you're hungry," he muttered under his breath, setting the can on the floor near the bear. The scent seemed to rouse it. The bear stirred, lifting its massive head with groggy slowness. Its amber eyes met Andrew's briefly before shifting to the can. With visible effort, it shifted its weight, dragging itself closer to the offering. Andrew tensed instinctively, stepping back as the bear's muzzle dipped toward the salmon. For a moment, the only sound in the cabin was the soft clink of the tin as the bear licked its contents clean. Andrew watched, a mix of awe and disbelief washing over him. The scene felt absurd, him standing in his tiny cabin, feeding a grizzly bear like it was some kind of oversized house pet. When the bear finished, it let out a low, almost contented rumble and settled back onto the floor. Andrew retrieved the empty can, his movements slow and deliberate. "Guess you're not picky," he said softly, more to fill the silence than anything else. The bear didn't respond, of course, but its gaze lingered on him, steady and unblinking. Andrew felt an odd sense of being studied, as if the animal were trying to gauge his intentions. It was unsettling, yet oddly grounding, a reminder that he was sharing space with something far beyond his control. The hours passed in a strange rhythm. Andrew busied himself with small tasks, splitting firewood, sweeping the floor, preparing his own meager meal of oatmeal and black coffee. All the while, he kept an eye on the bear, half expecting it to suddenly rise and assert its dominance. But it remained where it was, its movements limited to the occasional shift of position or flick of an ear. By mid-afternoon, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the world outside buried in a fresh, pristine blanket. Andrew stepped out onto the porch, pulling his parka tight against the lingering chill. The air was sharp and clean, the kind that burned in your lungs but somehow made you feel alive. He scanned the horizon, noting the absence of tracks leading to or from the cabin. Whatever had driven the bear here, it had come alone. As he turned to go back inside, a flicker of movement caught his eye, a shadow darting through the trees. Too small to be a bear, but large enough to make his pulse quicken. He squinted, searching for the source, but the forest remained still. Back inside, the bear's gaze was fixed on him, its head tilted slightly as if it sensed his unease. Andrew shook his head. "Probably just a deer," he muttered, though the words did little to calm him. The bear shifted, letting out a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't a growl, it lacked the edge of aggression, but it carried a weight that made Andrew pause. "What's your story, huh?" he asked, sitting down a safe distance away. His voice was softer now, almost contemplative. "Why did you come here?" "Why me?" The bear didn't answer, of course, but Andrew found himself speaking anyway. He told it about the years he'd spent out here, about the accident that had taken everything from him, his wife, his daughter, the life he thought he'd build forever. The words came haltingly at first, but once they started, they didn't stop. It was as if the bear's silence drew them out, a mirror reflecting his own isolation back at him. By the time he finished, the cabin was bathed in the soft amber glow of the wood stove. The bear had closed its eyes, its breathing deep and even. Andrew leaned back in his chair, exhaustion tugging at him. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel so heavy. It wasn't the suffocating void that had pressed in on him since the accident, it was something else. Something closer to peace. As the fire crackled and the shadows danced across the walls, Andrew closed his eyes, the weight in his chest feeling just a little lighter. The next morning, the cabin stirred to life slowly, its warmth holding back the biting cold outside. Andrew rose from his chair, his muscles stiff from a night spent dozing. The bear remained where it had been, sprawled near the stove. Its breathing had steadied, though it still moved with a heaviness that hinted at lingering pain. Andrew crossed the room, careful not to disturb the massive creature. He added another log to the fire, watching as the flames flickered and grew. For the first time in years, the cabin felt alive, not just because of the bear, but because of the quiet hum of purpose that had begun to take root in him. The bear stirred as the warmth spread through the room, its amber eyes opening slowly. Andrew found himself once again caught in their gaze. "Morning," he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. He didn't know why he spoke to it as though it could understand, but the words felt natural. The bear didn't respond, of course, but it shifted slightly, its injured paw sliding awkwardly across the floor. Andrew frowned. The bandage he'd applied the night before was already coming loose, and the wound beneath it needed more attention. "Hold still," he muttered, grabbing the first aid kit from the counter. He knelt a few feet away, his movements slow and deliberate. The bear watched him, its gaze steady but calm. It didn't growl or flinch as he reached for its paw, though the tension in its muscles was palpable. The wound was worse than he'd realized. Frostbite had taken hold around the edges, the skin blackened and brittle. He cleaned it as gently as he could, wincing at the bear's low rumbles of discomfort. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I know it hurts, but I have to do this." The work was slow and meticulous, every movement a delicate balance between care and caution. By the time he finished, the bear's paw was wrapped in fresh gauze, the wound protected from the cold. "There," he said, sitting back on his heels. "It's not perfect, but it'll do for now." The bear shifted its head, its eyes locking onto his. There was no aggression in its gaze, just an unspoken weight, a depth that made Andrew's chest tighten. He swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. "You're stronger than you look," he murmured, offering a faint, shaky smile. "I guess that makes two of us." The rest of the day passed in a quiet rhythm. Andrew split his time between tending to the bear and completing the small chores that kept the cabin running. He checked the generator, restocked the woodpile, and prepared a simple meal of soup and crackers. He even boiled some water and added honey, pouring the warm mixture into a shallow dish for the bear. To his surprise, it drank, its massive tongue lapping at the liquid with deliberate slowness. Andrew watched, a strange sense of satisfaction blooming in his chest. He'd spent so long feeling like a failure, weighed down by the mistakes and losses of his past. But now, for the first time, he felt like he was doing something right, like he was helping, even if only in a small way. The bear's presence filled the cabin in more ways than one. Its massive frame took up most of the floor near the stove, but it was more than just its size. There was a life to it, an energy that seemed to seep into the space around it. Andrew found himself drawn to the bear, watching its every move with a mixture of fascination and awe. By mid-afternoon, the storm had left behind a fragile calm. Andrew stepped outside to clear the snow from the porch, his breath misting in the frigid air. The world was silent, the kind of silence that made everything feel distant and surreal. He shoveled in slow, measured strokes, his mind wandering to the bear inside. It was strange to think about how much had changed in such a short time. Just days ago, his life had been an endless cycle of monotony, his days blending into one another in a haze of isolation. But now, everything felt different. The bear had broken through the barriers he'd built around himself, stirring emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. As he worked, a sound drew his attention, a faint rustling in the trees. He froze, his heart pounding as he scanned the forest. For a moment, he saw nothing, but then a shadow flickered at the edge of his vision. It was low to the ground, moving with a deliberate, almost cautious grace. Andrew tightened his grip on the shovel, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't the bear, he was certain of that. But whatever it was watching him. The shadow lingered for only a moment before vanishing into the trees, leaving Andrew with a sense of unease that clung to him like the cold. He finished clearing the porch and returned to the cabin, the door shutting behind him with a soft thud. The bear looked up as he entered, its head tilting slightly as if sensing his unease. Andrew set the shovel against the wall and moved to the stove, adding another log to the fire. "Saw something out there," he said, glancing at the bear. "Don't know what it was." The bear rumbled softly, the sound low and resonant. Andrew paused, his brow furrowing. It wasn't a growl, but it wasn't exactly neutral either, it almost sounded like concern. Shaking his head, he sat down in the chair near the stove, rubbing his hands together to warm them. The bear settled back onto the floor, its breathing evening out as it drifted into a restless sleep. Andrew watched it for a long time, his mind churning with questions. Why had it come to him? What had driven it out of hibernation, into the storm and to his door? And what had he seen in the trees? The answers fell just out of reach, like fragments of a puzzle scattered across the snow. But one thing was certain, whatever had brought the bear here, it wasn't finished. Something was waiting just beyond the edges of his understanding, and Andrew had the uneasy feeling that he was about to be drawn into it. As the fire crackled and the shadows lengthened, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the bear. The cabin felt quiet but not empty. For the first time in years, Andrew felt a glimmer of connection, a fragile thread tying him to something bigger than himself. And though he didn't know what lay ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life, once frozen in place, was finally beginning to thaw. The night was darker than usual, the moon hidden behind thick clouds that turned the world outside into an endless void of black. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, its flickering light casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. Andrew sat on the edge of his chair, the faint glow of his flashlight slicing through the dimness as he studied the bear. It had woken earlier, restless and uneasy, its head swiveling toward the door every few minutes as though it were listening for something Andrew couldn't hear. The bear let out a low, rumbling noise, almost like a groan, and shifted its massive body. Andrew frowned, leaning forward slightly. "What's wrong?" he asked softly, even though he knew he wouldn't get an answer. But the bear's gaze met his, steady and unyielding, and for a moment, Andrew felt like it was trying to tell him something. Then it moved. With more strength than he'd seen from it since it arrived, the bear pushed itself to its feet, its injured paw still held slightly aloft. It stood there for a moment, towering and imposing, before letting out a soft huff and turning toward the door. Andrew froze, his heart pounding. "You want to go outside?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The bear didn't respond, not that he expected it to, but it took a halting step toward the door, then paused, looking back at him. Its amber eyes were intense, filled with an urgency that made Andrew's pulse quicken. He swallowed hard, gripping the arms of his chair. "You want me to follow you?" he murmured, the realization hitting him like a cold gust of wind. The bear huffed again, the sound low but insistent. Andrew hesitated. Every instinct in him screamed to stay inside, to let the bear leave if it wanted. But the look in its eyes stopped him. There was something there, something that felt deliberate, purposeful. He grabbed his parka and flashlight, his boots crunching against the wooden floor as he moved toward the door. "All right," he said, pulling the door open. "But if this gets me killed, it's on you." The wind hit him like a physical blow, sharp and biting as he stepped outside. Snow crunched under his boots, the cold seeping through his layers almost instantly. The bear lumbered forward, moving with surprising determination despite its injury. Andrew followed, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the uneven tracks the bear left in the snow. They moved slowly, the forest around them eerily silent except for the occasional creak of tree branches weighed down by snow. Andrew's breath came in quick, visible puffs as he trudged through the drifts, his flashlight darting nervously over the shadows that stretched between the trees. "Where are you taking me?" he muttered under his breath, though he knew the bear wouldn't answer. The bear paused at the edge of a small ridge, its head tilting slightly as it sniffed the air. Andrew stopped a few feet behind it, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Below the ridge, the landscape sloped gently down into a shallow ravine, the snow glowing faintly in the dim light. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the same endless expanse of white that had surrounded him since the storm began. But then, just at the edge of his flashlight's beam, something moved. Andrew's stomach clenched as he focused the light on the shadow. At first, it was difficult to make out, just a vague, shivering mass huddled against the base of a tree. But as he moved closer, the shape came into focus, and his breath caught in his throat. Cubs. 2 of them, barely more than bundles of fur, curled tightly against each other. Their tiny bodies trembled, their eyes half-closed with exhaustion. Andrew's pulse quickened as he glanced at the bear beside him. "They're yours," he said softly, the realization dawning on him. The mother bear let out a low rumble and began descending the ridge, her movements slow and deliberate. Andrew followed, his heart pounding as they approached the cubs. Up close, the sight was even more heartbreaking. The cubs were painfully small, their fur matted with ice and snow. One of them let out a faint, pitiful cry, its tiny paw stretching weakly toward its mother. Andrew knelt beside them, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "They won't make it out here," he muttered, his voice tight with emotion. He looked up at the mother bear, her massive form towering over him. Her amber eyes met his, filled with a desperation that mirrored his own. "I'll help them," he said, his voice firm despite the lump in his throat. "But we have to get them back to the cabin." The bear didn't react, but she stepped back slightly, giving him space. Andrew carefully scooped up the first cub, cradling its fragile body against his chest. Its fur was cold and damp, its tiny heartbeat faint but steady. He hesitated for a moment before reaching for the second cub, tucking it gently under his arm. "We need to move fast," he said, glancing at the mother bear. "Come on." The trek back to the cabin was grueling. The snow was deeper than it had been the day before, each step a battle against the freezing wind. Andrew's arms ached from carrying the cubs, but he didn't dare slow down. The mother bear stayed close, her injured paw dragging slightly as she trudged through the drifts. By the time they reached the cabin, Andrew was gasping for breath, his body trembling from exertion. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, the warmth inside hitting him like a wave. Carefully, he set the cubs down on a folded blanket near the stove, their tiny bodies curling instinctively toward the heat. The mother bear hesitated at the threshold, her massive frame silhouetted against the night. Andrew turned to her, his voice low and soothing. "It's okay," he said. "You can come in." For a moment, she didn't move, her amber eyes flicking between him and her cubs. Then, with a heavy huff, she stepped inside, her claws clicking softly against the wooden floor. She lowered herself beside the cubs, curling protectively around them as they nuzzled into her fur. Andrew watched in silence, his chest tight with a mixture of relief and awe. The scene before him was surreal, a mother bear and her cubs, huddled together in the warmth of his cabin, safe from the deadly cold outside. He sank into his chair by the stove, his body heavy with exhaustion. The fire crackled softly, its light casting a golden glow over the bears. Andrew leaned back, his eyes drifting shut as the warmth seeped into his bones. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel empty. It felt alive, filled with the quiet hum of connection and purpose. And as he drifted into a restless sleep, Andrew couldn't help but wonder how much his life was about to change.